Hello, you're listening to Kopi Time, a podcast series on markets and economies from DBS Group Research. I'm Taimur Beg, Chief Economist. Welcome to our 74th episode. Over the past 2 years of the global pandemic, we have focused like never before on healthcare and life sciences. No amount of economic or financial measures could help us overcome the pandemic. The solution had to come in the form of vaccines and therapeutics, from research and application developments. And for that, the world's hope rested on scientists and doctors, nurses, and public health officials. So today, let's take a journey through the healthcare sector with Sol Magaz, partner, life sciences and healthcare at EY. Sol has over 2 decades of experience in consulting in the industry. She has advised big pharma, emerging biopharma, medtech, diagnostics, consumer health companies, as well as trade associations, labs, and hospitals. All of this across a range of issues, from strategy to organization and operations, and from R&D to commercial. Sol Magaz, welcome to Kopi Time.
Thank you so much. And we're very excited to be here. It's an honor to be part of this podcast. Looking forward to the discussion.
Pleasure to have you. Sol, you have deep experience in strategy consulting in the healthcare and life sciences space. So let's begin with you perhaps sharing with us how the sector reacted and adjusted to the pandemic, both in the West, but as well as in Asia.
Yeah. So I think it's a very good question. Taimur, I think a little bit like you mentioned, the first thing we have to do inevitably, right, is just acknowledge the human impact, right, that this has had. And I think as of a few days ago, we were already at over 480 million cases globally, at over 6 million deaths, right? So, yeah, the toll has really been extremely significant. Now, that said, right, what we find is that both in the West and in the East, there's been two main activities, right, that are two main impacts that have taken place. One is, as it happens, and we've seen with prior crises, not only the SARS crisis, but also the global financial crisis, we've seen that the health and particularly the pharma life sciences sector is a little bit more resilient than some other industries, right? So if one looks at the top 10 less affected sectors by diminishing shareholder returns, life sciences will be around 4th or 5th, and then medical technology will be a little bit further below, but still top 10, right? So that's something that we've seen generally, because it is obviously a sector one that tends to be more resilient. There's less elasticity, less sensitivity, right, to prices, etc. So people unfortunately continue to seek, etc. In this case, though, the other impact that we've seen is a big drop in certain types of health activity, naturally, right? All resources turned in this emergency situation to care for COVID patients, right? And in the research and in the manufacturing arena, as you were saying, to manufacture and try to accelerate R&D for therapeutics, for vaccines, as well as for diagnostics and supplies, the consumables, etc., related to the pandemic. So on the one hand, more resilient industry. On the other hand, big push and acceleration with government and authorities' commitment to get to those vaccines as fast as possible, to get to some of the therapeutics for patients who are already infected as fast as possible. And we saw that in a matter of about 6 to 8 months after the pandemic had started, we already had over 140 therapeutics in research, and we were already very close to having the first 5 or 6 vaccines approved, right, which is unprecedented, and a level of global research collaboration that we've not seen before. So that's encouraging. Now, on the other hand, if we look a little bit more at that drop in activity and by segment, we see first in 2020 a little bit more impact in Asia Pacific, but I would love to hear your point of view as well, obviously as an expert, right? Than in a little bit less impact in Asia Pacific, than in the West and in the US in particular in terms of the drop. Partly because Asia Pacific has already been growing pretty fast because we need to catch up in many of the markets, right? Yeah, that said, in what we've seen is the unplanned acute type of health needs, right? As well as the elective surgeries, right? Or regular checkups and diagnostics. All of that suffered tremendously during the pandemic and is still below pre-pandemic levels, right? And just to give you one data point that I find very worrying, and we'll have some public health ramifications down the line. When I was discussing to some of my clients that are the biggest players in oncology, they've seen in quite a few markets the rate of new cancer diagnostics drop to half the pre-pandemic levels, right? And obviously, epidemiology doesn't justify that. So we'll have to face cancers that are diagnosed later and therefore are more complex and also with other types of diseases, right? Again, elective surgeries for any spinal or any orthopedic types of surgeries have been pushed back. Anything that was not life-threatening has been pushed back as much as possible. So all of that will continue to have ramifications. So the industry has seen an increase in activity and demand on diagnostics, on therapeutics and vaccines, and definitely a decrease in other activities and other therapeutics and in supplies. Additionally, because of the supply chain disruptions, right, we've seen big impacts on prices of some basic medicines, not only in the East, but also in the West, right? That has put additional cost pressure on the systems, particularly those that are less developed or less mature. I would say these are some of the high level kind of big brush impacts that we've seen. But if you want, we can double click a little bit on the various aspects or segments.
Sure. So I remember at the very beginning of the pandemic, we had shortages everywhere, right? Even in Singapore, I think initially we were discouraging people from wearing masks because we didn't have enough masks for frontline workers. That, I think, got sorted out pretty quickly. The supply chain responded pretty fast. But what is the situation now? I mean, is everybody manufacturing masks and PPEs locally, or is it still mainly coming from China and going to the rest of the world?
Yes, it is. There is some local manufacturing, but now, the supply chain has kind of stabilized. So there's still a lot coming from China and other parts of the world, and the supply chain has reset a little bit. When those shortages happened, as you mentioned, Singapore was very lucky. We were very lucky because they mobilized a lot of the semi-institutional players, right, who activated their own networks, right, and reprioritized their own work to make sure that they would connect to suppliers or that they would turn some of their manufacturing facilities into manufacturing facilities that now were manufacturing masks or now were manufacturing hand sanitizer, etc. In other countries, it wasn't as easy, right, and as fast to do that. And then that's with masks, but we've seen also shortages with vaccines in quite a few countries, right, including very developed countries like Australia, because of challenges with procurement, more than supply chain, I would argue in that case. But yes, there's been that has stabilized them significantly.
What about the role of the public sector? I mean, we saw in the US Operation Warp Speed, and we also saw in China, of course, as always, a lot of top-down push to come up with a response to the crisis. What about sort of global experience? I mean, is it the case that more proactive public sectors have managed to actually get the best out of the private sector?
Yeah, I would argue it is the case, right? There are examples pretty much everywhere, also across Europe, of these emergency committees being formed and actually being effective in changing things on the ground. For instance, in the UK, EY collaborated with the military and the National Health Service under the supervision and the oversight of a newly created pandemic committee, and they built. I think it was a pretty large hospital in about 19 days, when usually the time to build that type of facility would have required at least 9 months, right? So a lot of push to get the best resources and prioritize the resources for emergency response. I think we've seen that, in most countries. I think without that government commitment, it would have been much more tragic than it's already been in most countries. Yeah, like you say, not only China, the US, but also Europe, and both across R&D, manufacturing, and then the infrastructure as well.
Now, you mentioned earlier that there's this troubling probability that is sort of rising because people are scared to go to hospitals and they've not taken diagnostics that they would have probably gone through every year. I think you mentioned oncology. I think I specifically read about ovarian diagnostics, oncology in the US collapsed by 50-60%. So the fear is that there'll be a pickup in ovarian cancer detection going forward. Are we seeing healthcare systems, governments trying to make up for lost time? Are there campaigns underway around the world to get people back into annual health checkups and diagnostics because we have sort of lost time in the last couple of years?
Yeah. My view, I don't know what you think. I'll be very keen to hear, but my view is I have not seen enough of let's see, right now that one thing that I thought was very admirable, for example, in the UK, when that emergency oversight committee saw that work was starting to slow down, they said, we're not going to dismantle it, we're going to turn it into looking at other public health priorities. But this is going to take time, much longer than we saw in terms of the crisis response. So I don't see yet enough focus there. I think we're still managing the variants, right? Managing the boosters, managing which cohorts of patients need to get vaccinated and boosted, including children, including the vulnerable, and looking at these measures. So I've not seen enough yet. I know quite a few pharma players and trade associations are really trying to put that in the agenda because they see, obviously, they can foresee, they have very good data, right? What these, as you say, the drop in diagnostics in ovarian is a difficult cancer. So if it's caught late, it can be very problematic. So I have not seen enough action there, but I'm confident that in the next few months, if things continue in this relatively positive trend, at least from a public health perspective, they'll shift attention to all those other priorities.
Right. And I think it's important to recognize that it's not either or. I mean, we're not going to win conclusively against COVID in the next few months. It'll have to remain in our radar. But I think we have neglected other things for a pretty long period, and it's time to sort of focus
precisely.
on
exactly.
Extent. I
particularly this. Sorry, go ahead, please.
No, go ahead.
No, just going to say particularly these types of. I mentioned oncology particularly because it was so top of the agenda of most governments, right, pre-COVID. So we should just continue with that. They should just continue with those efforts. Yeah.
Right. I even worry about, basic chronic illnesses like, people with kidney complications. I think one is very scared to go to a clinic and sit next to people who may or may not have COVID. And I sort of worry that if dialysis type care also has suffered because of this pandemic, because, the fear factor of going to a hospital. Absolutely. Because although we've seen that tremendous shift to telemedicine that peaked particularly in 2020, it seems like now it's starting to stabilize, especially in the West, although in Asia Pacific it continues to grow, probably because it comes from a lower basis and we need more general healthcare coverage. But all those things that have been successfully turned to telemedicine do not include these types of interventions that you mentioned, right? Dialysis, diagnostics, no matter if you send all the imaging or you send the biopsies outside, which we're probably doing anyways, to analyze and do next generation sequencing and so on, the patient still has to go in for a biopsy, right? Or just has to go in for the MRIs and the scans to be taken. So that those aspects, do present a bottleneck in a way. Absolutely. So, Sol, I was going to ask you this question later, but I think it sort of dovetails with what we're discussing right now. We always say that, a big crisis gives us lasting lessons on their legacies, but perhaps not. Perhaps as soon as the crisis is over, we forget how bad things were and we just go back to square one. So what's your view? I mean, we've had this global crisis. At least on paper, we should realize that it's an interconnected world. Viruses respect no immigration requirement or visas. They just go from country to country. Even countries like Australia and New Zealand, so secluded, so careful, had the virus raging through their societies. Are you seeing a possible silver lining out of this crisis, that we will come out of it recognizing our interdependence and focus on public health a little more?
Yes, I definitely see that. Yes, I think all governments have recognized that the connectedness has been what's allowed and enabled, for example, the fast development of the vaccine drugs, as well as the fast approval of some of the therapeutics, as well as exchanging data and insights, right? Allowing to predict what's going to happen next in terms of the variants and the number of deaths, the ICUs, etc. So I think there's a big, strong awareness of the benefits of that connectivity and that collaboration. So I do trust that is there to stay. On the other hand, so that's more from a government perspective, government response, as well as R&D collaboration. On the other hand, I've also seen really pharma and biopharma companies having to rethink significantly the way they organize themselves and the way they go to market, right? So despite this tragedy, another silver lining that I see is I see a strong transformation, profound transformation of some of these players from relatively traditional, relatively conservative risk averse for very good reasons, right? Safety is at the heart of everything they do, and hence they're highly regulated and have very strong compliance controls, and that will remain. But they've had to rethink, for example, how they are focusing on their own customers, right? So say hospitals, doctors, etc. As a lot of this telehealth trend continues to happen, their own customers are not accessible face-to-face, or have not been accessible face-to-face for a long time. So they've had to rediscover how to engage digitally with them, how to engage digitally and support providers, labs, hospitals. And they've had to rethink and really putting their customers at the center of what they do. So we've advised various companies that have completely changed their go-to-market models from the traditional functional siloed, I do marketing, I do medical, I do sales, and we all do a little bit in parallel, to really streamlining a lot, removing layers in the organization, increasing capabilities in data and analytics, increasing capabilities in insight generation and customer intimacy. So I see something that will be positive for the industry. I see more innovation as well in terms of the way they leverage data, they use data. Before the pandemic, when it wasn't that difficult to run big trials, it's always difficult, but it wasn't that difficult to run big trials. Maybe we were starting to make efforts in leveraging data for the control arms, for instance, of clinical trials, but not tremendous amounts of efforts. Obviously, the pandemic has disrupted R&D and clinical trials tremendously. Some trials had to be halted completely, or enrollment was much slower. So many drugs have been delayed in coming to the market. But we're starting to make more efforts in what we call synthetic trials, where, yes, we will have an arm of patients that are treated, but if we have very good data of patients that are virtually identical and we can mine a database, maybe we don't need to spend all those resources, all that effort, and all that time recruiting patients for the control arm, right? So that type of innovation is also something that I think is going to benefit us all by bringing solutions to the market sooner.
Yeah, expectations are also going to be higher. I remember,
yes.
Sol, I'm sure you do too, that in the summer of 2020, the view was the vaccines were a couple of years away in the best case scenario. But now we have shown the world that, within a year, it can be possible to safely roll out a vaccine. So next time there's a pandemic, your clients will be under even greater pressure to come up with quick solutions.
I agree. And frankly, at 20 years plus in the industry, and I work with a lot of vaccines players, and I was blown away that not only they did it, but also they clearly work and they are safe. So yeah, you're right. That sets a new standard.
Indeed. I will share with you one anecdote. So I came back from Dubai last weekend. And before coming back to Dubai, I had to do a supervised antigen rapid test. But I did it via Zoom. A Singaporean provider connected with me over Zoom, and they just watched me for 15 minutes, putting the thing in my nose and then putting in the cassette. And it was a fifth of the cost of a, in-person ART test. And it was seamless. This would have been unthinkable 2 years ago.
Unthinkable. And it's amazing in Singapore that now that is quite common. And as you say, a fifth of the cost, much less of your time. No risk going to a healthcare facility where inevitably there are risks, not only COVID of infection, etc. Yes, with my mom, who was visiting Singapore some months ago, also she had to have a checkup, and the first checkup was in person. The follow-ups, the Singapore clinic said, let's do them over Zoom, so she doesn't have to bother to come into the clinic. And that was fantastic. Also, as consumers, another trend that we see, right? As all of us as patients, as consumers, have become more demanding, more discerning. This is what we are asking for, right? So providers need to try to improve the experience that we have with healthcare as well.
And on that particular issue, any difference between the East and the West, or we're seeing sort of expedited digitalization of healthcare services all across the world?
Yeah, I think generally, I don't see much difference. Maybe the what's a little bit that makes a difference, but it's not so much based on the digitalization, but the starting point, right, is that in the East, particularly some of the markets that were less mature or less developed are leapfrogging, right? So many of them will start some of the more rural or outer areas of certain countries like Indonesia, like the Philippines, that have real accessibility issues, but the penetration of smartphones is already extremely high, right? They will leapfrog to doing telemedicine without having gone through the more access to the traditional infrastructure in some cases. But other than that, I think, we see generally similar trend, even in the East, between markets that are more mature, more infrastructure, very developed, like Korea, versus others. We see that switch. And interestingly, at the beginning of the pandemic, in some markets, like Korea was a very good example, where no one believed that doctors would ever kind of really turn to digital for their work. In a way, because we didn't have much choice, many did turn to digitalization. And although there will be a new normal, and it won't be all digital, of course, they will retain a level of digital, right? For the benefit of the patient, for their own benefit. So that's encouraging. The other thing we've seen is it depends a lot on the types of doctors, right? Like even in Singapore, oncologists who typically are quite a globally connected community of key opinion leaders, because there's so much advancement and progress, right, and experimentation. So they are used already more to webinars and seminars. They work in multidisciplinary teams traditionally. So in Singapore, oncologists were quite quick to adopt digital for their multidisciplinary teams, their tumor boards. However, in Singapore, psychiatrists, for instance, were much slower to make that shift because it's not something that they were used to, right? So it also depends a little bit on the specialty and the way they were working before, not only on the country and the culture.
That's fascinating. And I'm really glad that you brought in the leapfrog argument, because we've seen this over the last 2 decades. In poor countries, we saw people leapfrog from having no phones to mobile. So landline was skipped.
Exactly.
In places like India, we see people not even having access to banking services, but leapfrogging into fintech.
Exactly.
So it seems that a lot of these acceleration of digitalization disproportionately helps the poorer countries, the less developed countries, that allow them to leapfrog. And I think on telehealth, I think anybody who has spent hours waiting in a hospital for the doctor to see them for 5 minutes, there's no going back. I think we will never want to repeat that experience, and we'll want to have a digital window. Okay, enough about the pandemic. I think we're already shifting away from the pandemic. Let's talk about, independent of the pandemic, there are mega trends happening in this industry. Share with us, you work with all the big providers of healthcare. What are the big trends in pharma and biotech that we should sort of talk about?
Yeah, so I think I was thinking a little bit about that as we were getting ready, right? There's one, I have to repeat it because digitalization is a very important trend, as you say, pandemic or no pandemic, and it helps across, even with the challenge of affordability. We can touch on that a little bit later if you want. We also see another mega trend definitely is a shift in the types of portfolio, the types of R&D that is coming through the pipelines, right? Over the last 10 years, we've seen a very strong focus in oncology, in immunology, in rare disease as well, and in biologics, right? So I think until a couple of years ago, 40% of the drugs in the pipeline globally at any stage of development were oncologics, and 3 out of 10 were biologics, right? And that was great. It's tremendous amount of progress, great, better outcomes, so very positive. But in the last few years, we see an acceleration towards precision medicine, right? So very personalized medicine, particularly on the back of the explosion of genomics and next generation sequencing. We were looking recently at all the global and regional players that we have on that play in next generation sequencing, either as a solution for diagnostics, for R&D, for patient identification, as well as for treatments, and to determine what's the right treatment for a patient. And really, there's more than 20 that are very relevant players already, right? And again, it's not only oncology, but and immunology, but also other types of diseases. So that's something that is going to change the prognosis for many diseases that before were life-threatening, and that now through the next generation sequencing, understanding their genomic makeup, and then being able also to do cell and gene therapy, right? So do alter the cells, alter the genes, do interventions that in various instances are cure the condition, right? Even for leukemias and these types of diseases. So precision medicine, personalized medicine, cell and gene therapy is a big jump. And then additionally, vaccines and prevention in general, right? So we've seen big push in development of vaccines, programs that were already in place before the pandemic, but that continue to accelerate. I think they are helped by the increased awareness of vaccines from all of us and from all governments. But we have very important programs of vaccines development in HPV, in other respiratory conditions, in HIV, in some forms of cancer. So I think, early prevention, vaccines is going to be another big trend when it comes to the portfolio or the types of pipeline that pharma and biotech are developing. The third one, which is quite impactful, maybe slightly slower, is digital therapeutics, right? There are already some digital therapeutics approved. That is some apps, for instance, that help with the improvement of symptoms of Alzheimer or of Parkinson's disease through doing certain exercises. And they are trialed and they are FDA approved, just like pharmaceuticals are, right? They have a slightly different pathway and framework, but we see more and more digital therapeutics as something quite promising, sometimes complementary to the existing arsenal that we have to fight a disease, say, particularly in central nervous system and dementia, but sometimes as a standalone, and that's quite promising.
Well, that's really, really fascinating. I'm very pleased to hear that. I think digital therapeutics makes all the sense in the world. I have to be honest, I had no idea, but it makes sense. Yeah. And I see the promise and the application. So the innovation, both in terms of new, scientific breakthroughs, but as well as, improved innovative practices by embracing digitalization. Are these all largely happening in the West and we're following here? Or are we seeing the Chinese companies or Southeast Asian companies or the Koreans, the Japanese also part of this spectrum?
Yeah, excellent. So when it comes to product innovation or solution innovation, so say a cell and gene therapy, genomics, testing, and so on, Asia is extremely active, and in particular China. we have at any given point like hundreds of cells and gene therapy companies, many pre-revenue startups, but that have very good pathways, and there are probably some hope to then sell their assets and their technology to larger players. But there's a lot of innovation and research, and some of the big pharma players have set up some of their incubators and innovation labs in China as well, right? So some of the top immunology companies, top oncology companies, even top respiratory companies have innovation and incubator labs in China, and they might have them as well, say in Central Europe and the US, right? So from a product innovation, it is great. One area where is a little slower maybe is in terms of the big data and mining and getting insights from the big data, but it's just because there is less of that structured data readily available, right? In the US, in Europe, they've spent years already consolidating healthcare data and population-based data and census data. So now with the ability that we have to do advanced analytics and predictive analytics, they are in a better position. Here, we still have to build a lot of that data. We're going fast, particularly countries like China and countries like Singapore, they're moving fast, but we're a little behind, right? In order to be able to do all the applications of advanced analytics and predictive analytics on our databases, because they are not the same, right? Korea has fantastic data, but some of the other countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, are still relatively behind, right? Some hospitals are digitalizing as quickly as they can. They're installing new ERM systems, new data systems, but that takes a little bit of time to consolidate.
What about India?
India is very interesting because in terms of the product innovation, maybe we see potentially a little bit less of that. So fantastic manufacturing. They still cover about 20% of the API manufacturing, about 80% of the finished product manufacturing of traditional pharmaceuticals. So extremely powerful footprint from a manufacturing perspective. Obviously, very interesting and an attractive market because of its sheer size. But I think we've seen a little bit less of product innovation, less than we've seen in China. And partly, sometimes there are certain concerns around IP protection and the level of guarantee that some companies have when they run some of these programs there. However, in India, because they're also kind of leapfrogging, right? We've seen examples of that unbanked population that you were mentioning, the same unbanked population that exists in India or in Vietnam. We've seen some very good fintech solutions coming up for health for that type of population, right? There is in particular a company called Arogya Finance. You might be familiar with them. They have an algorithm, a proprietary algorithm, that in a very short period of time, I think in maximum of 2 days, retrieves enough information about a family that may not have traditional banking solutions in place, right? And can determine whether they could provide them a loan for healthcare interventions. I think it started with some implants in the cardiovascular space, and now it's expanded to other therapy areas, and the rate of default is extremely low. So we see these types of solutions that really move the needle happening more and more. And similarly as well, maybe with the consolidation and aggregation of data and the supply chain, right? As you know, retailers are extremely fragmented, right? So now there are various companies that are connecting them and helping them, say, with inventory management, with mining some of their data, and in exchange they get the consumer data and they make it a procurement platform on the back of it, right? So there are some of these solutions that are quite promising. So that innovation is definitely present. We see it in India, quite a few good examples.
Well, that's great insight. Now, all this innovation and the R&D, this expensive stuff. And we've already seen some fights break out between manufacturers and regulators wanting to not allow the prices to go up. And the manufacturers are saying, well, next time there'll be no innovation if you keep on doing this. So let me ask you the tough questions. I don't expect you to give me a definitive answer, but I want to hear your view because you deal with this, I'm sure. That, how do companies and governments strike that balance between the cost of new medicine research and breakthrough and affordability?
Yeah. So for now, I'm not sure they do. There's big efforts behind it, but for now, there's still big gaps in affordability, right? And if we look at the more developing or less mature markets, what's happening even as they increase their universal healthcare coverage, and we've seen that happening. Well, even in very advanced societies like Korea with extremely good healthcare, they've been expanding universal healthcare coverage in the Philippines, in Indonesia, in Vietnam, right, in Malaysia. But what that means is really population coverage, right? So often it's the basics. And what happens is that some of the most advanced technologies or some of these interventions that we are saying are very promising and are extremely expensive to develop get squeezed out of the public system. So what we see is an increasing desire to create public and private partnerships, an increasing desire to explore fintech, insurtech solutions that can have a reach and a scale that before was unthinkable, and really can provide some of these affordability answers, right? So we'll see more and more of these private solutions. Again, in India, there's some Tofi insurtech that, and because of the scale, they are able to provide very low cost insurance against things like breast cancer and prostate cancer as well. And they even do campaigns that would say, like for Mother's Day, maybe you can give that insurance to your mom via social media, etc. Right? And if it reaches that critical mass through insurtech, which before was absolutely unmanageable, it becomes a viable product, right? Similarly, in China, we've seen a lot of crowd sourcing, very effective, although it has some regulatory challenges and the landscape might change now. But we see these new types of solutions that allow more and more of the population to access where governments might not be able to reach on their own.
So the final question is this overarching theme of healthcare security. We're worried about food security, energy security, but also I think the last 2 years pandemic has shown that everybody needs to have greater stockpiles of emergency supply of things because emergencies seem to be coming with greater frequency these days. Do you see the healthcare sector moving closer to the government as a result, that the government would either by mandate or through subsidies procure a lot of things to keep in storage and also try to subsidize the cost of next round of R&D?
Yeah, I think on the first part, definitely, right? I see that they are going to want to have more control over certain manufacturing capabilities, and they're going to be able to mandate to have certain stocks and inventory in the countries. We've seen various examples of that. More control or more funding over R&D depends a little bit on the country. There's some skepticism, right? Some say that it's not a model that works particularly well, just like the academic model doesn't seem to be the fastest or the most productive. So the jury's still out. But I guess in terms of mandating, that certain stocks inventory remains here. I think that is something that we are going to see in different shapes depending on the types of regimens and political kind of systems. But in subsequent form, we'll see it everywhere. In terms of R&D, some countries are pushing for promoting a lot of, again, incubators and innovation-based platforms. So they will supply funding, they will supply coaching, they will supply some infrastructure and logistics, right, to promote that type of innovation from in-house. But other countries, I don't think, are going to be that inclined to invest there. But what do you think?
Well, I think that you're sort of hinting at the answer that I was looking for, which is a bottom-up ecosystem makes sense. regulating, from a top-down perspective and putting on mandates on big companies, I don't think works that well. So I think to the extent that, you create a system where a lot of young people do set up companies which come up with amazing ideas like an mRNA concept and then become a big company, which of all the countries, Germany has shown us that it can be done from concept to fruition within a decade or a little more than that. I think that that's instructive, and hopefully that is the path that countries follow, because that's the right way of doing that.
Exactly. So anything that helps shape the ecosystem, right? So that there's more of that kind of ground, but from a private sector perspective is really good. For instance, Alibaba and Pfizer is in the public domain, of course, created with the Singapore FinTech Academy, a healthcare fintech kind of a plan that asks startups to pitch for their potential fintech solutions for health and pharma, right? And that's getting from startups and small companies to also even university teams looking to see what solutions could be exciting and interesting, right? And then those who win get quite a bit of help. Alibaba, I think, provides some of the bandwidth. Pfizer provides some of the coaching, and some of the technical aspects are provided by the Singapore FinTech Academy. But it's these types of solutions, like you say, that induce the bottom-up ground are very promising.
I think that's a good note to end on. Sol Magaz, thank you so much for your time and insights.
Thank you, Taimur. I've really enjoyed our conversation as always, and thank you very much for having me. It's been an honor.
It's been great, and thank you to our listeners as well. Kopi Time was produced by Ken Delridge from Spy Studios. Daisy Sharma and Violet Lee provided additional production assistance. This is a podcast for information only and does not represent any trade recommendations. All 74 episodes of Kopi Time are available now on YouTube and all major podcast platforms, including Apple, Google, and Spotify. As for our research publications, webinars, and live streams, you can find them all by Googling DBS Research Library. Have a great day.
Thank you.